Hi, this is Colin Sandberg from Backbone Performance, and I thought I would try to post some brief videos with my answers to common questions I get from athletes. While I always encourage athletes to reach out to me when they have questions, there's some things that come up often enough that thought it's worth it to make some videos that can be used as a resource for coached and uncoached athletes alike. Try to keep this brief, so let's get started. Question: how important is power to weight ratio? Um, so first of all, let's define what power to weight ratio is, and this is something that's a little bit more complicated than you might think. So let's imagine we get in a time machine. We go back to like 1990, or when power meters first are just becoming available, but nobody has any idea what to do with them. And let's say I put one on my bike, uh, and my wife, who's 110 pounds, puts one on her bike, and we don't know what we're doing with them. We're just riding up a hill side by side, and she looks over and says, how much power are you putting out? And I say, oh, I'm going at about 300 watts. How about you? And she says, oh, I'm only putting out 215 watts, but we're going the same speed. So you quickly figure out in using the power meters that you can't just look at power, absolute power, and compare apples to apples. So we start talking about power to weight ratio. And if you've ever had a VO2 max test, or you are familiar with the term VO2 max, usually when you say somebody has a VO2 max of 60 or 70, you're talking about relative VO2 max, meaning relative to their body weight in kilograms. So that unit, when we talk, the unit we normally talk about with VO2 max is milliliters per minute per kg of body weight. So, if we just talk about it in absolute terms, somebody says, I have a VO2 max of 4,500 milliliters per minute, meaning they can consume 4,500 milliliters of oxygen at maximal aerobic capacity per minute. Well, if you weigh 140 pounds, that's pretty good. That's like 71, VO2 max of 71. If you weigh 200 pounds, that's kind of, not looking quite as good. It's about 59. So power to weight ratio, back to me and my wife riding up a hill. I'm going at 300 watts, and I'm 170 pounds or 71 kilograms. Putting out 300 watts, that's a power to weight ratio of about 3.89 watts per kilo, and that's normally the unit we talk about this in. And for her, that's a power to weight, she's at 110 pounds or 50 kilos. That's power to weight ratio of 4.31. So, does that mean she's working harder than I am? Not necessarily, because it comes down to the effort relative to the ability, and also it comes down to physics. So one of the problems with power to weight, when we just throw out that term power to weight ratio, is that a lot of people throw it around and don't really define what they're talking about. And I would say very often what they are talking about is functional threshold power to weight ratio. And functional threshold power is the maximal power output you're capable of for about 60 minutes in a pseudo steady state condition. So without dissecting that too much, the important part there is the 60 minutes. And I don't know who's watching this, but most of us are not doing 60-minute hill climbs. In fact, there's really not many of them. Even if you look back at the Giro this last month, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest climb there was the Col de Fenestra, which was just under an hour for Froome, probably close to an hour and a half for most of the sprinters in there, the people just trying to get over it. And really, I live in Philadelphia. Most of the climbs around here are 3.5 minutes. I can ride, and be within riding distance of a 5 or 10 minute climb. But if I want to do a 20-minute climb, I'm gonna have to drive couple hours. So certainly some people might have those 20-minute climbs. I can't ever think of anything longer than 20 minutes that I've done in a race situation. So my point here is that really what we can do for an hour or 60 minutes is not necessarily the full story here. It's not necessarily determinant of what we can do for 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 1 minute. And really we have to look at those various varied time increments. And the standard ones that people use are 5 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and 60 minutes. And depending on where your numbers stack up on the chart, we can get some idea of whether you're a sprinter or a pursuiter or a time trialist or an all-arounder, or what kind of profile you fit into. Now, when I say the chart here, what I'm talking about is the chart that will show you, theoretically where you're stacking up against riders of different levels. And I will show you what I'm talking about here. This is the chart that I'm talking about, and hopefully you can see that there. But what this shows is the power to weight ratios of various levels, and up here you have international, world class, highest level, international pro, domestic pro, cat 1, cat 2, cat 3, cat 4, untrained, and this is 5 second power, 1 minute, 5 minute functional threshold, or 60 minute, and the blue is for men, the pink is for women there. So just sort of standard ranges there. So the way this was originally designed, you would sort of do tests of varying length. You do a 5 second test, a 1 minute test, a 5 minute test, and a threshold test, or by some means you'd see where your numbers stack up here, and you'd see what kind of profile you had. So you would expect a time trialist to be sort of higher in this threshold, this 60-minute area, higher than average, maybe higher in the 5 minute, but probably lower than average in these categories. So you'd see more of a line like this, and you'd see the reverse for a sprinter. You'd see somebody who's really high up here in the 5 second and 1 minute, but below average for the 5 minute and the threshold. So you'd see more of a curve like this. And then an all-arounder, of course, you would see more of a flat line all the way across. And there's also classification that some people use for a pursuiter, which would be somebody who is sort of really good in the middle, the 1 minute and 5 minute, but maybe not as good for the absolute 5 seconds full out sprint, or for sustained threshold power. And that's all great, and it does a pretty good job of profiling those different types of riders. The problem, or one of the problems with this that we run into, is that people pay a little bit too much attention to these things over here, and they say that okay, this will be typical range for a cat 3, range for a cat 2, range for cat 1, whatever, and they'll look at it and say, okay, if I want to be a cat 2, I need to be in this range, and that shows approximately, this range for threshold for cat 2s is about 4.1 watts per kilo to 4.8 watts per kilo, and they'll say, okay, I need to get in that range. The problem with that is that for a 140-pound rider, for instance, 4.1 to 4.8 watts per kilo comes out to 260 to 305 watts, which is reasonable, and I'd say that's just off the top of my head, that's probably about right. Not impossible, but if we're talking about a 200-pound rider, that comes out to 373 to 436 watts at threshold. That's a lot of power, and that is, you know, maybe not impossible, not out of the question, but it would be extremely high for a Cat 2. And with those kind of numbers, I would really expect somebody in that range to be a Cat 1 or even a Pro. Okay, I'm going to turn this back around. So let's say we have a group of riders of relatively the same ability, and we line them all up by weight. And what we're going to see is, yes, the bigger riders tend to put out more power, similar ability, but that's not a linear increase. As you go along that chart and you see heavier and heavier riders, the amount of, and you draw a trend line there, the amount of wattage in your power increase you see per pound goes down. So it's not a linear increase, it's more of closer to what they would call a logarithmic increase. And I can show you a chart of that just for those of you that aren't as familiar. So that would be, whoops, okay, that would be a chart more like that. And as you see, you go further along the chart, and the amount that it's going up is decreasing. The rate of increase decreases, if you're following me. So in general, you would expect to see that bigger riders put out more power, but have lower power to weight ratios when we're comparing same ability, same category. Now, before you big guys go and jump off the roof because I've just crushed all your dreams, hold on just one moment. Hang in there, because there's a bunch of things that favor you. First of all, you have to remember that weight is only one of many opposing forces when you're riding a bike. The others are aerodynamic drag, rolling resistance, drivetrain resistance, braking force. And if you're riding along a flat road on a road bike, good pavement, you're not hitting your brakes, your bearings are in good shape, your drivetrain's clean, the vast majority of the opposing force on a flat road is aerodynamic drag, not gravity. It's about roughly 85% of the opposing force is aerodynamic drag. It's only as the road starts to tilt upwards and you slow down that a higher percentage of that opposing force comes from gravity and a lower percentage comes from aerodynamic drag. And the thing is, even in the hilliest races, there are still major sections of flat roads, downhills. It's not just all uphill unless we're talking about an uphill time trial. And even then, there can still be some pretty fast sections. There's a saying that aerodynamics are important all the time. Weight is only important some of the time. And really, in general, it would be more valuable to look at power to aerodynamic drag ratio instead of power to weight ratio, but that's a lot harder to measure. So we talk about it with weight. Now, to be fair, bigger riders are in general less aerodynamic. Again, if you take a bunch of cyclists of similar category / ability, line them up by weight, you'll see that in general, you draw a trend line looking at aerodynamics, that the heavier riders are less aerodynamic because they're bigger. But it's not a linear curve. Again, it's a logarithmic curve, and the amount of extra aerodynamic drag you see per pound goes down. So, you know, a rider who's 200 pounds might be twice as heavy as a 100-pound rider, but they're not twice the aerodynamic drag. It's less than that. So let's look at some examples here. And let's take a 5-minute climb, average grade of 5%. We've got two riders. Rider A is 170 pounds, rider B is 140 pounds. And let's say rider A can put out 355 watts for 5 minutes, which is 4.6 watts per kilo. And going back to that chart that I showed earlier, that's right in the middle of the supposed range for Cat 3s. So here I use a tool called Bike Calculator. It's bikecalculator.com. I think this is really valuable, and you can plug in some of these numbers and see how fast somebody is going. You know, for let me see if I can bring this up here. And okay, so this, I plug in 355 watts, and rider weight is 170. Let's see if I can get a little closer. 20-pound bike, 5% grade. They're going 13.72 miles per hour. I'm not sure if you can see that exactly at 355 watts. Now we look at the 140-pound rider, rider B. I can put in 140 pounds here and then put in 13.72 miles per hour, and you'll see that comes out to 308 watts that they have to do to go that same speed, to go 13.72 miles per hour. So you say, yes, okay, that's less, but that's a power to weight ratio of 4.85 watts per kilo, which again, going back to that chart, that is at the top of the Cat 3's bottom Cat 2 range, as opposed to, I told you, the bigger rider has a power to weight rate, a 5-minute power to weight ratio of 4.6, which is right in the middle of the Cat 3's. So relatively speaking, if we're just going by that chart, that smaller rider has to be at a higher level in terms of power to weight ratio than the bigger rider. And you can run all sorts of calculations here, various grades, comparing different riders, but I'll tell you a couple takeaways. And one is that if you've got two riders with the same power to weight ratio riding up a climb, the rider with the higher absolute power always wins. Same power to weight ratio, if you've got higher absolute power, you will win. Now, there are some obscure exceptions to that, but basically, yeah, power to weight ratio is good, but you can't forget the absolute power either. And keep in mind, this does not mean that bigger riders have an advantage on climbs. I think that's kind of a no-brainer. We all know that. And that's because the bigger riders, as they, though they tend to produce more power, do tend to have lower power to weight ratios than the smaller riders of the same roughly same category, same ability level. And despite being a little bit less aero, the absolute power is more important on the flats and downhill sections. So two, when we talk about climbers, we're not just talking about people who have a high threshold power and a low weight. A real climber is somebody who can accelerate, change their pace, and most climbs are not a steady grade. They get steeper in some sections, flatter in others, and if you look at a pacing strategy, there's really a huge advantage in accelerating over those steeper sections. But that isn't something everybody is equally able to do. Case in point, you look at the Jura just finished up here. You look at a guy like Tom Dumoulin, and he can maintain a really high power, but he can't really make the accelerations that the real climbers, guys like, say, Simon Yates or Nairo Quintana or Alberto Contador can. Dumoulin's much more of that time trialist profile, meaning he can maintain a really high power output, but those accelerations are going to be tough. Now, Tom Dumoulin is still relatively light. I looked up his stats and Pro Cycling Stats. They have him listed as 6'1" and 153 pounds, but you compare him to Simon Yates, who's listed as 5'8" and 130 pounds. That's a significant, that's over 20 pounds difference there. And we talk about those accelerations. Bigger riders have to work much harder to accelerate, even on a flat road. So another way to put it is, if you've got Simon Yates riding side by side with Tom Dumoulin up a climb, and Yates puts in an attack, he accelerates from, say, 15 miles per hour to 18 miles per hour. And you can calculate his power output and say, okay, steady state, 15 miles per hour for Simon Yates, that's 331 watts. To go 18 miles per hour to steady state, that's about 435 watts. But that doesn't factor in the acceleration to get there. And really, when you put in an attack, we're looking probably Yates put in about 800 watts for 5 seconds, gets up to 18, then he can sit back down, settle in at 435 watts. But Dumoulin, to jump up and follow him in that, he's probably going to have to be not just at a higher power, maybe 950 watts, but for a longer time. It's going to take longer, maybe 10 seconds. And that might seem negligible, 5 seconds versus 10 seconds. But you do that 100 times in a race, and it can crack you. Now, of course, anyone who watched the Giro saw that Yates did crack in the last week. Chris Froome, guy who is sort of in between, meaning in between the time trialist and the climber profile. He is a time trialist, but he can still make those accelerations better than the guy like Dumoulin. Ended up dominating the race, and that, of course, is another reason why we race the race. We don't just look at the numbers and hand out the checks beforehand. So back to the original question here. Power to weight ratio, how important is it? It's not as important as you might think. And if you take any sort of statistics class, you hear the phrase correlation does not necessarily equal causation, and that's true here. So while there may be somewhat of a correlation between power to weight ratio and success, meaning that if I'm comparing somebody with a threshold power to weight ratio of 5 watts per kilo to somebody with a power to weight ratio of 3 watts per kilo, the guy with 5 watts per kilo is probably going to be faster in most situations, although there again, if we go back to the power profiling chart, if that guy with the power to weight ratio of 3 watts per kilo can sprint at 2,000 watts for 5 seconds, he probably will win more races than the guy with 5 watts per kilo, assuming he can finish the race and get to the point of the sprint. So, if there's one thing I want you to remember here, it's that you should not get too caught up in this number, this power to weight ratio number. And I know that a lot of people will sit around and obsess about this, and they'll think, I need to get to 5 watts per kilo or I'm just not going to perform well. Or maybe they look at it in the negative. They say, oh, I'm at 4.5 watts per kilo and I'm just not going to be competitive at that number. No, there's so much more that goes into it, and it's a waste of energy if you're obsessing about these numbers when you should be focusing on your training your limiters, and maximizing your strengths in order to do it. And on a final note, since part of that obsession can lead some people to really focus too much on weight loss, and I don't want to get into a whole thing on weight loss here because that's a whole nother topic. But I just want to say that if you have a little bit of weight to lose, like less than 10 pounds, when you actually calculate how much being 10 pounds lighter will help you, for most people it's pretty minimal. And, if you can lose it in a safe, healthy way, great. And sometimes you work on your nutrition a little bit. It's also going to help your training, give you better, cleaner fuel for your training, and that's great all around. But if you do a crash diet, or you risk getting sick, or your training is suffering, or if you just waste a lot of mental energy just thinking about this, and you don't have much of a sense of self-confidence because of a weight, or you end up messing up your metabolism more in the long term, it's definitely not worth it. Now, if you have a lot of weight to lose, like 15, 20 pounds, it might be worth spending a little bit more energy thinking about it. Again, from a risk versus reward standpoint, not going to be worth it to do some sort of crash diet or something. But if you can get to a point where you're not carrying around that spare tire and it doesn't affect your training, it will help you to lose that weight. But very often it's not because you have a higher power to weight ratio, it's because you're more aero. If you're thinner, you're probably more aero. And you can get more comfortable on your bike. You can adopt a more aggressive position. You probably have better heat regulation because you're not carrying around that added layer of insulation. And like I said before, if you've worked to adopt a healthier diet, you probably feel better in your training too. So I know that was a long one. Hopefully I didn't just confuse you more on this. If you have any questions you'd like me to answer, write them in the comments or email me at colin@backboneperformance.com. Happy riding.